Good afternoon. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us and allowing us to share with you the stories and experiences from our past that help shape our future and our identity. Hi, I'm Nancy Takayama, president of the San Fernando Valley JACL. We are very honored to sponsor this event. Okay. I met Kyoko Oda nearly 2 decades ago when I first returned to the Valley and joined JACL. At that time, I knew little about the concentration camps. As I self-educated more about the incarceration, I discovered the differences between the camps and the emotional stigma Tule Lake incarcerees carried and passed down. Along with hearing from Nancy, we will hear from friend and Professor Jean-Paul deGuzman, or JP to many. I met JP when he was an Asian American Studies student at CSUN, and he is my go-to person if I have any questions regarding JAs, but especially JAs in the Valley. He will be giving us a bit of a history lesson, but in a way that will captivate you. Our third panelist, Soji Kashiwagi, who I have known through Grateful Crane Ensemble. Before becoming a Grateful Crane board member, you can say I was a groupie. I attended every performance I could since the early 2000s. Soji is a descendant of a Tule Lake incarceree. His father, Hiroshi Kashiwagi. Hiroshi shared with Soji his experiences, and now Soji shares with us. We are here today to listen to the experiences that was inspired by the journal writings of Tatsuo Inouye. To best describe how this book came to light, I would like to read just a small portion of the foreword to understand the emotion and passion this book has brought to us. Many years ago, my father, Tatsuo Inouye, and I sat in the family kitchen to transcribe his Tule Lake Stockade Diary. My 2 little boys were sleeping in the back room while we cranked it out night after late night in a smoke-filled room until the term paper was finished for my Asian American class at UCLA. It was not just an assignment. It was our family story, our voice, and my father's personal stamp on American history. As a Sansei, granddaughter of a Japanese immigrant born at the end of the incarceration, I am the first to say that I don't have any memories of the camp. There were 33 letters written between my parents, where some were penned by the military guard in the stockade in order to pass the censor. What touched me most was my parents' love through this crisis that brought me into this world. I was named Kyoko, which means cooperation or harmony, because they were hopeful for a better future. Okay, before we continue with our program, I would like to note that the Tule Lake Stockade Diary book can be ordered via Tule Lake StockadeDiary.com website. As seen on the screen, and hopefully it was changed for you. Thank you. Kyoko has also made available a student price. Just after hearing our panelists, we will have a question and answer period during the program, and you may click below the Q&A button to ask any questions or add comments under chat. Our first panelist, J.P. deGuzman, Ph.D. at UCLA, is a comparative race historian of the 20th century. He writes on urban history, Asian Americans, American Buddhism, and has published numerous articles for the academic article and a wider public in the AmeriAsia Journal, California History, Rafu Shimpo, Lions War, forthcoming, and others. He teaches U.S. history at Windward School and Asian American Studies and LA history at UCLA, where he earned the university-wide Distinguished Teaching Award. He served on the board of the San Fernando Valley JACL since 2006, yay, and helped establish the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition. Thank you. And JP.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to be here, and thank you very much, Nancy, for that really wonderful introduction. So before we begin, I want to begin with much gratitude and acknowledgements. First of all, I want to acknowledge the Tongva people whose land I'm sitting on right now and whose land was later tilled by generations of Japanese Americans. I want to express my profound gratitude for Kyoko Nancy Oda, who I've known for about 20 years, whose indefatigable spirit and unwillingness to be cowed by any circumstance in her pursuit of truth and justice is a model of inspiration for so many of us. Although I'm not a person of Japanese ancestry, I want to acknowledge all of the ancestors and those who were wronged by World War II, whose legacies continue to compel all of us, regardless of our background, to right the wrongs of the past and to act boldly to ensure those indignities and affronts to our constitutional rights never happen again. Now, my presentation, you'll see, is called The Contested Politics of Loyalty in America's Concentration Camps, and that language is very deliberate. The word concentration camp holds great meaning in our collective global society, and it's important that we use the language of the federal government itself to truly understand the gravity of this experience. My goal today is to provide the broadest historical overview of the controversial loyalty questionnaire and its infamous questions 27 and 28 as a way for us to have a little bit of context to dive into a much richer story that Kyoko and Soji will share with us. If you're curious to learn more about the loyalty questionnaire, I encourage you to look up the works by scholars such as Brian Masaru Hayashi and Kirsten Lyon, who have written specifically on imprisonment and the constitutional basis of the loyalty questionnaire and other experiences. So I'm sure many of you have seen images like this that speak to the profound contradiction of World War II. That a nation ostensibly fighting to defend global democracy upended the lives of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, compelling them to signal their loyalty to a country that saw them as subversive agents and dangerous racial others. This image, however, is also an entry point into a question that speaks to the rich, complex, and contested history of Tule Lake that we'll learn about today. What exactly is loyalty? Today is not a question about who was loyal or who was not loyal, but rather what exactly is loyalty? How do we reconcile loyalty to a nation, loyalty to our families, to our communities, or to our deep-held principles? As we dive into the words and the worlds of Tatsuo Inouye and Hiroshi Kashiwagi, we'll learn that the answer to such vexing questions defy easy answers. And yet, that is precisely what the US government tried to do with its loyalty questionnaire. Indeed, the history of the wartime forced removal and mass incarceration of Japanese Americans is inseparable from the War Relocation Authority and War Department's effort to assess the quote unquote loyalty of Japanese Americans. By devising a registration document popularly known as the Loyalty Questionnaire, the federal government sought to bolster the number of recruits for the All-Nisei military unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and determine who could be granted permission to leave the camps, to assist with wartime labor, to pursue higher education, or other highly regulated purposes. Very scurrilous questions attempted to determine how quote unquote American or how quote unquote Japanese inmates were, as if the two could not and did not intersect to create a very rich hybrid community that was a part of a vibrant Japanese diaspora in California, in Oregon, all across the West Coast, in both major cities and small rural hamlets throughout the West Coast. Those questions probed inmates about family members and their experiences, where people had lived in the past and in the present. They asked about education levels, language skills, religion. They asked about what people did in their free time. What were their recreational activities? Who do they affiliate with? Who do they associate with? And who are their family members, both here and in Japan? What property did they own in Japan? And so, needless to say, this was no innocent document. This was no anodyne document asking for just basic demographics, but truly a controversial piece of government engineering that sought to divide a community. Needless to say, the more quote unquote Japanese the answers were, if someone identified as a Buddhist rather than a Shinto, if someone perhaps spoke both Japanese and English as opposed to just English, if someone was born in America but raised in Japan as opposed to just knowing just America, all of those answers could be the target for greater scrutiny, for greater ostracism, and for greater punishment. But as we might know, there were two particular questions that aroused the anger, the hatred, and the confusion of countless Japanese Americans. The first one was question 27, which stated, "Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty whenever ordered?" The next question, question 28, asked, "Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization?" Wow. That is something more than you'd ever fill out in a regular census form. And I cannot emphasize enough just how this document created utterly toxic debates over what people thought loyalty might be. It created tortured choices and divisions within camps, within blocks, within families, within relationships. And we can really think about how those debates and those questions, which did not have easy answers, answering yes or answering no, was anything but easy. We could think about the journey to answering those questions as being fundamentally tied to the diversity of Japanese Americans and the diversity of experiences across generations. If we think about question 27, the question which queries Japanese Americans about service in the military, we could think about the experiences and respect the experiences of many American-born Japanese Americans who freely said yes, who freely said, this is the only country I know, who freely said that this country is the country of my birth. This is the country where I have made a name for myself. We can respect the integrity of those who said that if this is an opportunity for me to liberate my family and my loved ones from the barbed wire that chained them to this land, absolutely, unequivocally, I will say yes. But it's just important and just as significant to acknowledge the deep-held integrity of those people who said no. Those people who felt a filial obligation to their loved ones and to their families who were here in America, but also in Japan, lest we forget that our roots run deep and run deep across the Pacific Ocean. We could think about those who righteously refused to answer yes, pointing to the hypocrisy of incarceration, noting that what kind of nation would ostensibly say it is committed to the principles of democracy when it would lock up 120,000 people, including a majority of whom were American citizens. We can also look at those who were very smart. These were not dumb people. These were people who looked at this haphazard, quickly thrown together legal document who said, would saying yes mean that I automatically volunteer to fight in this war? We can also look at question 28, which said, do you forswear allegiance to Japan? Do you swear to fight any foreign power, including Japan? And once again, a common narrative we hear is the people who said yes, who valiantly said, arm me with a rifle to defend this country. But we can also look at those who made more complex choices.
Right here.
We can look at the history of immigration laws in the United States of America that had consistently closed a golden door to Asian immigrants. We can look at the experiences of the Issei, whose stories oftentimes are forgotten in the World War II narrative, who, being barred from American citizenship, would have been rendered stateless had they answered yes to question 28. We could look at the experiences of the Nisei, who indeed were as American as apple pie, but said, why is our loyalty being questioned? Why am I being asked to forswear allegiance to the emperor when I never swore allegiance to begin with? We could look at the experiences of the Kibei, those who were born in America but raised and educated in Japan, who did hold an affinity to Japan, who did understand that Japan was their home. And of course, we could look at the Nisei, who, feeling once again that sense of filial obligation, heeded the call of their parents to say that, yes, America is your home, and your roots also stretch to Japan. So as we know, the journey to answering these questions was fraught. It was complex, and it held many, many implications. We could think about how many young men actually fought against these questions in the form of the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee, who again questioned the hypocrisy of a nation that would fight for democracy abroad, yet practice some of the most undemocratic actions possible at home. We could look at the ways in which people who answered no were segregated into Tule Lake, which we'll learn about more today. And how those people were painted as just blindly militant, aggressive, pro-Japan supporters, when in fact their answers were far more nuanced. And then, of course, we could think about the stigmatization of those who answered no to both, the infamous no-no boys, and how their principled response was sometimes weaponized against them to cast them as disloyal. And I want to conclude by noting that indeed, one of the sponsors for today's event is the San Fernando Valley JACL. And we cannot escape the complex and curious role of the JACL during this time period. That as a mouthpiece of the Japanese American community, was responsible for some very selective censorship of news and creation of a standard narrative that demonized those individuals who said no, who cast suspicion upon those incarcerated at Tule Lake, and instead called for government cooperation and military service. And as a student of this history, and as a person who is deeply shaped by issues of civil liberties and civil rights today, I think it's important to acknowledge that ongoing reconciliation in which descendants, family members are continuing to grapple with a lot of that shame of those who are imprisoned at Tule Lake. And it is so enriching to think about how this is a story of not either or, of both and. That is a story of both people who did take up arms to defend this country and people who stood on their principled ground to understand that to be an American is very complex, and that World War II is not a story of who is loyal and who is not loyal, but a story of asking, what is loyalty? And I hope that today's program will invite all of us to better understand and question what is loyalty to a nation, to our communities, to our families, and to our own principles. So thank you all for this opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, JP. Really appreciate the clarification of 2728. This was something that I learned about late in life, and I want to share a personal experience because we all have descendants, grandparents, parents who had to respond to 27 and 28. And I wanted to know. And so I wanted to know the consequences of how one would have to respond. So I asked my father, and he answered no to serve in the armed forces, and yes, that he would forswear his allegiance to the Japan emperor. And I understood this because my dad was the eldest son with a sister that was sick with tuberculosis and a younger sister that was always at her side. And of course, he had elderly parents. So it made sense that being the eldest son, he had to be the responsible son. But I never knew about his father. And I had uncovered a document during my research, and it was my grandfather's draft registration card, and which was unusual to see a draft registration card. And we figured out that he answered no to forswear his allegiance to the emperor because he was an immigrant. He was born in Japan, and he would not have a country if he said yes to this. And he couldn't become an American citizen. However, he answered yes to serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. And if you look closely at the draft card, you will see at the time that he was 62 years old. And he said, yes, I will serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. And so my theory was that I can picture my grandfather going, yeah, go ahead and draft me. I'm 62 years old. Put me in the Army. But of course, they wouldn't have done that because of his age. And so I kind of thought that was funny. That was kind of a smart move on his half. I didn't know my grandfather, but it kind of told me he had a sense of humor. Our next speaker is Kyoko Nancy Oda. And despite the cruel treatment by the US government, Tatsuo believed in America. He wrote that the world is in chaos and the future is unknown. But this child, Kyoko, will bring the community together, especially the family. Kyoko she and her husband Kay came to the San Fernando Valley with their two boys in 1967 to work at Roy Takeda's body shop on Van Nuys Boulevard. By 1972, they soon joined the athletics. When she retired from LAUSD, Kyoko worked with the community and Tuna Canyon activists. Kyoko began to transcribe the diary in 1970 and finally published the Tule Lake Stockade Diary in 2020. Kyoko, thank you.
Thank you so much to Nancy Takayama and the San Fernando Valley Japanese American Citizens League and JP. You are so awesome. Thank you. And I want to thank Soji in advance because I appreciate you joining me on this particular program. There was a lot of resentment about the loyalty question because we were already behind barbed wire. So people were asked to serve in the armed forces and defend the country that put them in these camps. My father answered no to question 27. That would send him to fight against his own brothers, perhaps even killing them. So my talk today is about the hunger strike. What could possibly be worth sacrificing your body to fight to reach a goal? My grandparents had begged him to change his mind, but he was firm in his decision. So the consequences was that by October 1943, my parents and two sisters were separated from my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, who were in the Poston concentration camp in Arizona. My parents had already been ordered to leave their home. They lost their grocery business and had to pack up to go to Poston. And now they were moved to an unknown place that was the Tule Lake Segregation Center. Shortly after he arrived, the man in charge, Raymond Best, ordered martial law. On November 13th, he was picked up from Block 38 and put into the stockade that was a prison within a prison. Originally, there were 9 men that swelled to over 200. Some were curfew violators, some were young boys. My father was a judo teacher. He was not a no-no boy. He was a man. He had to stand at roll call for 2 hours and 25 minutes with bayonets pointing at him while it was snowing. They needed blankets and medical care. So why was he there? What are the charges? He was interrogated by the military police and by the FBI 2 times. He was beaten, he was starved, he was tortured, and definitely humiliated. It was the last straw when the Spanish consulate remained neutral. The War Relocation Authority, the 1,000 troops and tanks bearing down on 202 innocent men. As you know, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution states that the citizens of the United States shall not be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. All 120,000 in American camps were denied these protections, but especially the men in the Tule Lake Stockade. My mother would often ask, why are they keeping you when you did nothing wrong? And although the letters were censored, my parents were able to exchange 33 letters. Cleverly, he had asked the guard to write in English so the letters would pass through swiftly. My mother was an American-born Nisei, so her language was English. My sister, Masako, would dream that she saw him and ask, why can't he come home? He wrote, I am working and will come home when I am finished. During this time, he missed Thanksgiving and my big sister's 8th birthday, but he always made sure that the girls got the Christmas gifts. He wrote about the food he ate every day like a routine, but eventually 1 tablespoon of rice became 1 teaspoon. How could anyone survive on that little to eat? The army used food as a means of control, of power. The men were driven to desperation after continued neglect of their medical needs, and that in some cases led to death. It must have been excruciating to see people die. One man from Hawaii was denied medical care. My father wrote, he was brought here to the mainland like a piece of luggage and treated like a dog. The men in the stockade asked if they could reach out to his sister to tell her about his passing, but the excuse was that the teletype was broken. How inhumane. In another incident on December 31st, he wrote, we continue to ask the army to admit Hamamoto-san to the hospital. Finally, a corporal in charge said, well, he can walk to the hospital. To this, the examining doctor shook his head and finally said, bring an ambulance into the stockade. Hamamoto-san was put on a stretcher. His eyes were swollen and he appeared to be in great pain. We felt terrible about this situation, he wrote, especially because he became sick in the stockade, but we could do nothing. So on New Year's Day, 1944, with snow falling on his head, 202 men embarked on a hunger strike. They demanded that all be released to the camp. They chose food as a form of resistance. It was a nonviolent act of protest. They signed a pact and presented it to the authorities. So at first, the men were full of spirit, but as the days wore on, they got sick or weak. The soldiers began to steal watches, food, and taunt the inmates by delivering lots of food. My father was willing to fast until their release, but one by one, the men became dizzy or wanted to eat. The number who wanted to continue the strike dropped to 45. He even went barrack to urge men to continue, but food won them over. He became critical of those who were the boldest at first, who jumped at the chance to eat. He was critical of their inability to fight hunger. The hunger strike lasted from January 1st to 7th. All during that week, my mother wondered, why hadn't he written? She was unaware of his silent suffering. By February 7th, there was suddenly no mention of breakfast, lunch, or supper anymore. He had a month to reflect on the disappointing hunger strike. Reading Saikontan quieted his mind. There's a judo saying, mutual welfare and benefit. Tatsuo was willing to sacrifice his life to benefit the 16,000 people left in the camp. You know, he spoke his truth when asked question 28, if he would forswear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America from any and all attacks by foreign or domestic forces, or forswear any allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization. He had answered neutral. Inouye was a Kibe from Kumamoto, Japan, born in Laguna Beach, so it was very complicated. Writing his thoughts and fighting with the pen kept him from feeling hopeless. Judo principles guided his behavior to be a gentleman and leader of men. Whether you answered no, no, or yes, yes, the Japanese and Japanese American were forced to put their lives on hold, made the best of the situation, and fought hard to keep their dignity. During his 3 months in the stockade, he was able to process being tortured. He was able to forgive his fellow inmates, his jailers, and America, the land of his birth. He wrote in the diary, "I got on my knees and prayed fervently for the camp to recover in peace. I prayed for the day when the administrators would discard their prejudices. I prayed that the camp would become a safe place." Working on this diary burst my bubble. I would be confused and shaken that my beloved country betrayed me and my family. We pledged allegiance to the flag at school, at programs, and I was always proud to be an American. It's become emotional and often impossible to work on it because it was so difficult to understand. I would stop when I couldn't take the abuse that I was visualizing. My sister was only 4 years old and was severely impacted by her 3 years in camp, and especially the separation from my father. She cried every night, waiting for him to return. At the end of the diary, it was written that Masako jumped onto his lap with joy when he came back. Masako's healings began slowly after going to the Tule Lake pilgrimage and touching Mother Earth. We attended 2 more pilgrimages together, and we wanted to honor our parents. So we wore our judo gi at the Manzanar pilgrimage. For 70 years, Masako endured the trauma that led to her most powerful work. On the cover of the book, you see my 2 sisters at the bottom, then a man way at the back was out of the picture, so to speak. That's my father in the stockade. And there's my mother carrying a baby, me, all caused by Executive Order 9066 when our government failed us. Another composition had faces, many faces, that were grimacing that she saw as a child. No words can describe how she must have felt. My sister's life has motivated me to stand up for children at the border. History was being repeated. I know that these innocents will be impacted with the trauma and nightmares, just like my sister, through generations. This is unacceptable for me. Tule Lake is the most misunderstood camp of all World War II camps. It is an oversimplification to say Tulians were disloyal or troublemakers. We must end the discrimination of Tulians. And ultimately, we must end the discrimination of all people of color. I am proud to be a Tulian and hope that the people will better understand the turmoil that the loyalty question has caused, that it took strength to stand up for what you believed in. I am honored to share this story with you. My father's diary is a rare and precious account of his courage. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Nancy. I so appreciate that you shared your dad's diary, because we don't necessarily get to hear the emotions that our parents, grandparents, and anybody who was incarcerated, they were very strong people, and we basically only hear the facts, the history facts. And sometimes when our Nisei and older sanseis take the time to share, it takes a lot out of them to be able to confess, or to let us know. So what you're doing by opening the doors for others to be able to talk about what happened after the war, during the war, during being incarcerated is something that should be shared and passed down. So your courage is admired and respected. Thank you. We're going to go on to our next panelist, and Soji has so much to offer too. And let me introduce you to Soji Kashiwagi, who is the executive director and playwright for Grateful Crane Ensemble, a nonprofit theater company based in Los Angeles. A sansei originally from San Francisco, Soji has written intensively about the Japanese American incarceration experience in plays, articles, and on social media. Both sides of his family were indefinitely at Tule Lake, and his father, Nisei author, actor, and poet Hiroshi Kashiwagi, was known as a Tule Lake no-no boy for protesting his unjust and unconstitutional incarceration. Today, Soji is carrying on his father's spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, everybody. I just wanted to thank the San Fernando JCL for inviting me to be here today, as well as Kyoko Oda for your very moving talk, and also for the diary, which I was deeply moved by. It was often very painful, and I couldn't read it very, I had to stop, every few pages, because just imagining what my family went through the diary and just the conditions that they had to endure, it was just really tough, very painful to read. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you to JP for that lecture. I think that should be required viewing for so many of us in our own community, just to understand what those questions were and how it affected us, but also to a broader American audience to know that these questions were imposed upon American citizens during World War II. It's very valuable. I hope you take that lecture on the road. So thank you for that. So today I'm going to be reading a poem and also talking about what it was like to be a son of a no-no boy. So first of all, my father, as Nancy mentioned, Hiroshi Kashiwagi, wrote this poem as he sat on the bus heading up to the second Tule Lake pilgrimage in 1975. Not many of his fellow Niseis attended back then, but the Sansei children of the survivors, then young questioning college students, listened intently to what would become his signature poem, one he would read at every Tule Lake pilgrimage since his first one on April 19th, 1975. A Meeting at Tule Lake by Hiroshi Kashiwagi. The bus ride to Tule Lake in the night over dark highways, rain through the flatlands, and snow beyond weed, up to the roof of California, was a movement back in time, back to years 1943, 44, and 45, when I was 19, 20, and 21. Being among you, sensing your youthfulness, hearing your strong voices, I searched for reasons why I came after 30-some years. Tule Lake, Tule Lake. That was a name I dared not mention, spoken warily, always with hesitation, never voluntarily. But you have made it a common name again, of a sleepy, small, sleepy town that it was before we came here, before we were confined here, before it became Tule Lake Relocation Center, before it became Tule Lake Segregation Center for disloyal Japanese Americans. Yes, it's right that we're here to see firsthand where 18,000 of us lived for 3 years or more, to see again the barbed wire fence, the guard towers, the MPs, the machine guns, bayonets and tanks, the barracks, the mess halls, the shower rooms and latrines. Yes, it's right to feel the bitter cold of the severe winters, the warmth of the pot-bellied stoves, and the dust storms. How can we forget the sand biting into our skin, filling our eyes and nose and mouth and ears, graying our hair in an instant? Yes, it's right to recall the directives of the War Relocation Authority, their threats and lies, the meetings, the strikes, the resistance, arrests, stockades, violence, attacks, murder, derangement, pain, grief, separation, departure, informers, recriminations, disagreements. Loyalty, disloyalty, yes, yes, no, 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 yes. Issei, Nisei, Kibe. These are words now, but they were lived here. There were deaths and births and lovemaking in the firebreak with the warden's flashlight shining on you. Yes, and movies, socials, dances, sports, card games and religion, sewing classes, flower arrangement, doll making, wood carving, beauty behind barbed wires. Recreation was big. It was encouraged. Keep them occupied, keep them sane, for heaven's sake. But a Chronicle reporter observed, there are 18,000 mental patients living in confinement at Tule Lake. So it is right that I remember and tell it. I wish I could share the feeling I have now with the Issei and Nisei, they who lived here, they who do not speak of it, who pass it off as a good time experience. Whatever we did here, the commitments we made, loyal or disloyal, compliance or resistance, yes or no, it was right, because the young people make it so, because they seek the history from those of us who lived it. So we must remember and tell it. We must acknowledge it and tell it. So we are here, the Abalone Mountain, the Castle Rock, the dry lake bed where tules still grow. But the barracks, where are the barracks? And where apartment 4005D, home once long ago, sold, demolished, gone. Little remains except what's trapped in our heads, far back somewhere. I'm glad I made this trip. Somehow I feel a meeting of youth, your energy, your enthusiasm, your sense of justice, with the youth that I was, idealistic, intense, angry. It's a happy meeting. It is even better that I could stand aside after 30-odd years and see it, this meeting, to meet, to share, to learn, to struggle, to continue. I sense an immense feeling of continuity with you, all of you. Yes, it's right. It's right. And I'm glad I came back to Tule Lake with you. Okay, so that was my dad's poem. And now I'm going to read another piece. Back in 2017, the Gardena Day of Remembrance Committee asked me to talk about what it was like to grow up as a son of a Tule Lake no-no. And since we have a similar topic today, here's what I said back then with a few adjustments at the end. It's safe to say my experience as a son of a no-no has evolved over time. As kids, my brothers and I often heard cryptic references to this thing called camp. I remember wondering, was this some kind of summer camp or something? We didn't ask, and they didn't tell, and that's the way it was. In my teenage years in the 70s, my dad, Nisei poet and playwright Hiroshi Kashiwagi, was one of the few Nisei in San Francisco who was actually out there talking about camp. Because most Nisei at the time just wanted to bury everything about camp, put it underground and move on. But not my dad. He was angry and he was speaking out. The one thing I don't remember my dad ever talking about, however, was the fact that he was a Tule Lake no-no boy. Not in public, not at home. It was one of those dark family secrets, locked away in a closet, never to be opened. When I was in high school and college, I wrote newspaper articles about the heroic and amazing All-Nisei 442nd Regimental Combat Team and 100th Battalion. At the time, I remember looking at my dad and wondered why he wasn't part of this famed group of Nisei soldiers. To his credit, though, he never had a negative thing to say about what I was doing or the story I was telling, nor did he try to tell me his side of the story. I didn't ask, and he didn't tell, because that's the way it was. In my 20s, I moved down to LA and became more aware of the conflict between those who said yes, yes, and those who either said no, no, or were draft resistors. Rafu Shimpo columnist Horst Yoshinaga and Frank Emmy, leader of the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee, had an epic battle play out in the Rafu for weeks, both arguing their positions and pointing out how wrong each other was. Things turned ugly when Horst started calling all those who resisted the draft or said no, no to the loyalty questions troublemakers, disloyals, and basically questioned their courage for refusing to serve. Seeing this told me that this conflict and community climate was still hot and heated, even though 50 years had passed since the end of the war. I learned that it was part of a post-war narrative that had been created by leaders of the wartime JACL and those who said yes, yes to the questions. There were two types of Japanese Americans. The good JAs were hailed as heroes, and rightly so. The bad JAs, however, were branded as disloyal troublemakers, ostracized and stigmatized from our community, or they were simply ignored and left out of our historical narrative as if they didn't exist. And that's the way it was. In 2001, we started our theater group, the Grateful Crane Ensemble, and when someone asked me if I'd write a play about the No-No Boys, I said no, it was still too hot of a subject, and I didn't want to touch it. It wasn't until after attending my first Tule Lake pilgrimage in 2006 that things started to change for me. At that pilgrimage, I listened to no-nos like Bill Nishimura tell their stories. My own dad said he was always loyal to America and would have proudly fought for his country if his country released him from camp and gave him his rights and freedom back. How dare you put me in camp and then question my loyalty, he said. I am already a loyal American. I don't need to prove it to you or anyone else. And there it was, the truth. This is why my dad said no to the questions. He wasn't a disloyal, a coward, or a no-good troublemaker he had been made out to be. No, in the American tradition of dissent and protest, he said no and no to the questions, and he had every right as a citizen to do so. And as his son, I saw my dad in a brand new light and realized I could stand with him and his position all day and every day of the week. In 2010, I went on to produce my dad's play called The Betrayed at the Japanese American National Museum, which depicted both sides of the conflict as seen through the eyes of a Nisei couple who were torn apart in camp. And let me tell you, not everybody was happy that we were doing a so-called no-no play, but by then I knew his story and wanted to tell it, come what may. My new mindset was no longer one of shame and unease, and it was elevated even further when I randomly Googled the word troublemaker and came across a website of famous troublemakers, and among several, there were photos of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton. The word troublemaker, once so negative and shameful, had taken on a whole new meaning for me. And then I found this quote from founding father Thomas Jefferson, who said, quote, "If a government violates the very rights it is supposed to protect, then it is the duty of the governed to rebel." So that's what my father and Kyoko Oda's father were doing at Tule Lake in 1943. That's what our African-American brothers and sisters were doing at Selma, Alabama in 1965. And that's what tens of thousands of Americans across the country did just a few years ago when they hit the streets in peaceful protest, saying loud and clear, Black Lives Matter, and that an injustice against one is an injustice against all. By standing up and protesting, we were rebelling against the government's violation of our civil rights and human rights as protected under the US Constitution. It was our duty as American citizens. It is who we are. It is who I am. And that, my friends, is the way it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Soji. I find your dad is just amazing, and I know he has written not just plays but also other books that I think people would be interested in hearing. And we were discussing his poetry, and I'm getting a better grasp and understanding poetry now, thanks to your dad. Very much. We are going to move into the question and answer period, and excuse me. And if you have a question, just look at the bottom of your screen, and there's a button that says Q&A, and you can type your question in there. If you have a comment or a question, you can also submit it in the chat. If you're not able to, because you're on a phone, to ask a question, type in a question, you can tap the raise the hand button, and we'll acknowledge you and unmute you so that you'll be able to verbally ask your question. So let's see. I'm not seeing any questions at this moment, but we do have some other questions that were sent out prior to the to our forum. And I did kind of give the panelists a heads up on some of the questions. So as I read them, I'm going to let anybody who wishes to respond, you can just speak up. There was a query, was the stockade for troublemakers in any of the internment camps? Are you aware outside of Tule Lake if any of the other camps had stockades? It's more of a history question. So, and I actually don't have that. I'm not aware either. So,
from what I know, the Tule Lake was the only place that had this so-called stockade, or what they call a prison within a prison, and where they actually built a separate structure they called the jail, because it was a jail, and that was within the stockade. But I don't think any of the other camps had anything like that.
And I should actually know this questions, but for the question 27 and 28, what was the age minimum, or where I know the children, there were certain age children that they weren't required to ask to answer these questions. Do we know what the age group was for that?
The age was 18 above, and it applied not only to men, but also to women.
Okay. So anybody who was 17 and younger just basically followed their family.
That's correct.
Oh, okay. I was pretty rebellious at 15. So that wouldn't have been a requirement. I mean, that would have been a requirement if for anybody 17 and younger really had no choice, is basically.
That is why it's such a tragic story, because many families broke up. There are stories about husband and wives disagreeing, and husband goes back to Japan and the wife stayed here. And mother was pregnant and had to bear the child without support.
Yeah, that could be difficult. Let me check to see if there's anybody else out there who's has a question.
May I ask a question to Kyoko and Soji?
Sure.
Kyoko, you mentioned earlier, I know you spoke to some high school students, I guess for both of you. When you speak to young people who may have literally never encountered any of this history whatsoever, like really just broadly haven't even encountered the story of the forced removal and mass incarceration, and you are the kind of the first people to plant those seeds of knowledge. What are their reactions, and what are their curiosities? What are their questions, and what are some lessons that you want to really leave with them?
That's a very multi-pronged question. We just completed 26 sessions with the ABC Unified School District. And I must say how precious it is to have a Nisei speaker. I am like third hand, so to speak. And although I'm very passionate about this, I really value the words of an actual detainee like Min Tonai and Richard Murakami, and Mike Hachimonji, June Burke, Iku Kiriyama, because they were really, I think, their story is so riveting. So anyway, some of the questions are very basic, like they always want to know what kind of activities they had, or they'll ask something about the food. They're very curious about the food. But the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition had a scholarship called Mark Certified Scholarship for Justice project. And so I'm kind of putting these ideas together, but they really got the idea that diversity was the huge issue, and that we have to work together. And so although it seemed a little bit kind of lofty, it was amazing how the students grasped the idea that what could happen to us could happen again, and that they had to protect these rights. Many of the students were immigrants to the country too, so I think that really spoke to them, that we have to be vigilant. So in terms of reaction, some of the students really took it to heart. Some students just were interested in the social aspect.
I could speak to what I've seen as a bus monitor at the Tule Lake pilgrimages. I've seen a number of families attend. It's a full weekend event. So lately, at the last several pilgrimages, entire families, generations have been attending. And to see the younger folks, the Yonsei, Gosei generations, because our folks didn't talk about their experience, they're probably walking in with little to no knowledge of what happened to their families. Or even if they had some, when they get to the camp and they see it, this is a life-changing event for them. And when they get up and speak about their experience on the bus, they are just very emotional, just to think that this happened to their grandparents or great-grandparents. You could tell it's just very difficult for them to even grasp, but it hits them. And, you know, we're just now beginning to realize how the trauma of this experience has been passed down through generations. And now I think the younger generations, you know, who come to the pilgrimage are beginning to see or put the pieces, connect the dots together of, oh, this is why my folks are like that. And this is why I am the way I am. So, yeah, it's very important just to attending one of the pilgrimages. It's a very important experience for the whole family, I think.
I kind of noticed as I learned more about Tule Lake that a very long time ago, when the question that people always seem to ask other JAs is, you know, what camp were your family from? And so most of the people were okay with, you know, telling them what camp they were, except for the people from Tule Lake. And it was kind of sad, and I kind of recognized that it was a different type of shame that the incarcerated felt, different from all the other camps. And I was very pleased to hear Nancy Kyoko say that today that she was very proud that she came from Tule Lake. When did that happen for you, Nancy and Soji, that you no longer felt the shame, but now you can have the courage to say that you're proud?
Well, for me, I never felt ashamed because it's secondhand. But I think that it was really important to say it out loud, you know, and because I think that my parents were resistors. They were people who were honest with what they believed. And I know my grandparents were really heartbroken when we left. And Tomiko Nimura wrote about what I said, which the war did not break this family up, because what happened when we came back was we got back together. But there was never this snickering. And I have to say that it had to do with the fact that my father's in-laws were very respectful, and vice versa. But that had eroded, you know, at the end of the war, because people were divided by our own country. They were encouraged to fight. And so anyway, I really feel that to fight for what you believe in is very important. And I am really encouraged that after the George Floyd murder, that not only Black people stood up, but people all over the world stood up for human rights, you know, because, you know, our story is one that very few people stood up for us. And so we hope that this will motivate other people.
You know, the tragedy of the questionnaire and the stigma it created was this narrative of the Tule Lake no-nos being these bad people, and there was shame attached to the answers that they gave. And it was so strong that, you know, my father went to UCLA after the war, and he wore this sort of pork pie hat around campus, specifically to appear so eccentric that other Nisei wouldn't be comfortable approaching him or talking to him, because he was avoiding the question, what camp were you in? He didn't want them to ask that question, so he wore this silly hat and he acted kind of eccentric, so nobody would talk to him. And so it's kind of sad when he could have had Nisei friends at UCLA if this hadn't happened. And that's just one example. There's Nisei that have gone to their graves, you know, with never saying that they were at Tule Lake. When we did the play The Betrayed, we had no-nos in the audience. I know we did at this time in 2010, but not one no-no ever came up to me and said, I'm a no-no. They wouldn't admit to it to me, you know, who would be a safe person to tell, but they still didn't do it. So that's how strong this was, you know, the stigma and this really split within our community that still we're trying to reconcile to this day. You know, and first, I think, is just an understanding of what actually they were doing there. I think it's important to understand that they were, the idea of American protest and dissent is part of who we are. It's part of our heritage as Americans. And so to brand, you know, an entire group of people no-nos, you know, that just sort of stuck. And it's just really sad that that happened. But for me, you know, once I realized all these things about what this dissent and protest and being American is really all about, that's when I started to feel less shameful, you know, less and more proud and able to wear this shirt around. Although I don't wear it everywhere. It's actually my dad's shirt that he had and I inherited. But I think I'm going to start wearing it more because, you know, in the context of the protests that have been happening in the country, I think your everyday American can understand, oh, okay, there's that protest. Oh, so that's what those guys were doing at Tule Lake. You know, I think you could see the connection, right? So that's when it started for me.
JP, did you have a question? No.
No, I was just mindful of the question that Patty put in the chat.
Oh, yeah. I was watching, the questions too. Before I got to Patty's question, I wanted to add, in connection to Soji's recommendation about the Tule Lake pilgrimage. Back in 2016, I actually signed up to go to Tule Lake. Soji was the one that told me you have to hurry up and get your application in because they limit it. And I was lucky enough to be able to attend my very first Tule Lake pilgrimage. And because I understood at that time the shame that the Tule Lake incarcerated felt, I was a little unsure whether or not anybody would even talk, or they would be very quiet. But I was actually quite surprised when I boarded the bus in San Jose to drive, to be driven up to Tule Lake, that everybody that was on this bus was just so open and friendly. And I realized that this bus and the pilgrimage itself was a safe place, that people who were incarcerated all of a sudden felt that they could say let people know that this is where they were. They were willing to talk about their stories. And I found it amazing that this group of people that I had only known here in Southern California were so fearful of letting people know that they were incarcerated in Tule Lake. But when we boarded this bus and we got up to the pilgrimage, that it was a place where they felt like they were around family, that they could talk about it, and that they weren't the only ones. And I was given the opportunity to facilitate a workshop when I was up there, which was kind of weird because considering that I wasn't from Tule Lake, but they asked my job was just to get people to start a conversation. And I got to meet a whole lot of people in this workshop, and they had such amazing stories that they were willing to share because they knew they weren't going to be judged. They knew that they were with other people that experienced the same amount of fear, and sometimes, but the shame kind of disappeared as the days go on. So I am recommending, like Soji, the opportunity to go to Tule Lake is an amazing experience, just not the information that you receive as far as the history and the sharing, but the emotional impact, mental emotional impact that you have to gather with a group of people. Now, I've only attended the one in 2016. I very much wanted to go back, but because they limit the size of the pilgrimage, and they will always ask who is the first, this is the first time you've ever been there. And sometimes like half of the audience raises their hand, and because this is the first time that they've ever been there. And I thought, this needs to be shared. So I haven't signed up to go because I want somebody else to experience it. However, I did get to go with Grateful Crane because I as a groupie, I get to attend stuff like that. But because of that, I got to see again the number of people that are first timers, and so it's unfortunate that they only allow about 400. I don't know how many they're going to allow next year because of the pandemic. But please, if you have the opportunity, as soon as the application comes out, which is in February, watch your website. You got to get your application in fast and soon. It is such an experience that it's been 8 years now, and it's memorable. So I will now refer to Patty has asked actually 3 questions. It says, after the war, when meeting other Niseis for the first time, they would frequently ask, what camp were you in? What kind of response did the internees? Okay, well, we pretty much answered that one. What kind of response did internees from camps other than Tule Lake have? I don't know. Do you have a different response for this one? Does anybody else?
Well, the other camps didn't have the stigma attached to them. So the number one probably question Nisei would ask each other was, what camp were you in? Because that was the one thing they had in common, right? They all knew they all were in camp. And so that question became sort of like an opener for conversation. It's only the Tule Lake question, or the answer that was very difficult for people who were at Tule Lake.
Okay. How much division within your family was caused by the loyalty oath within your extended family? So this is not necessarily a Tule Lake question, but the fact that question 27 and 28, also very poorly written. I'm sure did cause a lot of pain within the families. So does anybody have any personal experiences they want to share?
Well, my father's brother, who also is a Kibe, was in Manzanar concentration camp at the time of the loyalty question. And he arrived in Tule Lake after the stockade had closed down, because I was curious to see if my uncle was there at the same time. So you will see his name at the Manzanar honor wall, and my cousins, and then he came up there. So the two brothers, both Kibe, were at Tule Lake, but my Sugimoto side pretty much stayed in Poston, Arizona. I wanted to mention a couple of things. You know, the picture behind you, Nancy, you know, that's a picture of my dad much later in life. You know, he's not this 33-year-old anymore, but that's the kind of person my father was. He was always reading or writing or thinking about what he had gone through. And I think sometimes people like him are judged as pro-Japan and maybe a little off the rails. But what I'd like to say is that he was a pacifist. He felt great sorrow about anyone dying or suffering during that war, and especially during the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing. And so one of the things he gave me was my name, which I think indicates his values. And it goes like this: at this moment, no one knows when the war will end. And no time is more crucial than today for the people and family to be united in one and cooperate in harmony. I give this child the name Kyoko. And so for those of you who are watching today and wonder why I have reclaimed my birth name, I feel like it's a homage to my father, and I feel his presence. And so I hope you can make that adjustment with me. That's very important to me. But thank you so much for coming. And thank you to Patty for such outstanding questions. Appreciate that, Patty.
You're welcome. A quick question for JP, being that you have students that you're, and I don't know if you're teaching any part of this Asian American history with JA experience, but I thought it would be an interesting lesson, seeing that we have a lot of immigrants in Southern California. And have you ever posed this question 27 to 28 and to see how they would answer it and how their parents would answer this question?
Yeah, when I taught Asian American history back at UC Santa Barbara, we went through this. And what was very, very fascinating was it was an Asian American history class. And by and large, the vast majority of the students outright, if I remember correctly, said that they would most definitely resist. They would answer no. They would, take on any consequence because they were so shaped by, a world in which activism is in the news, in the streets. It is in the social media they digest. So it was very interesting. But what was more fascinating to me was the Japanese American students who were in the class, whose families did experience this, were either chose not to participate in this little exercise, or were more introspective to probably say, yes, I probably would go along, and answer yes, yes. Perhaps because of, again, the stories that they had heard from their own families.
Well, thank you. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending and thank our panelists for offering their knowledge and their experience and sharing with us sometimes this very emotional subject for a lot of people. I did want to also mention, and Nancy's going to have to remind me if she could, that you were going to have another event, another Tule Lake Stockade Diary program in April. And would you be able to share that with us?
Well, I've been very fortunate to be invited to the Japanese American Museum in San Jose. And it is scheduled the day before Easter. I believe that's April 16th. And we are starting at 3 p.m. because we will have Masumi Izumi coming in from Taiwan that day, as well as Barbara Takei. And I'm trying to remember all of our other speakers, but they've been very, very supportive of this particular book, because I think especially they are even closer geographically to Tule Lake. And as you said, you caught a bus there. You know, it's part of my mission to tell my father's story. So it is coming up in April. And I would love everyone to come, because each time I learn more things. I learned a lot from JP and also Soji today. And, you know, I feel very grateful for everyone's support. We had the Mezinar Committee and Martha Nakagawa. And, you know, this kind of a thing that actually, when you say, how do I feel able to say I'm proud to be a Tulean, it's because of the support from our community. And so I appreciate that very much.
Thank you. I want to thank Evan in the background for everybody. Evan has been our technical guru and makes my life a whole lot easier. He did remind in the chat that we're going to leave up for a little bit that if you want to purchase the diary, he did put the link in the chat. So if you click on it, it will take you directly to the website, and it's most appreciated. Thank you, Soji. Thank you, JP. And thank you, Kyoko, for taking this time. And thank you, everybody, for coming out. I don't want you to go away or turn down, leave at the moment. Directly after this, we will, along with running the credits, part of Nancy's book collection, which you'll see, but I decided it was important for us to share Nancy's sister, Ernie Jane Masako Nishii, her artwork. And I didn't realize how many pieces she has, but every single piece that I saw was just so moving and touching that I thought it should be shared. Excuse me. That's how much it moved me, because her work is just amazing. So please stay logged on and take the opportunity to view Masako's work, her collection, and along with the necessary credits that go along with it. But it is in a loop. So if you miss it the first time around, it will come around a second time. And so I will wish to thank everybody again, and just stay logged on and enjoy Masako's collection. Thank you, everybody.
sister would dream about the searchlights following her and had nightmares that the one she made of the, where the guards were standing and they might shoot her. So it's very painful for her. Really, really appreciate JP and Soji. I think we were able to give an intimate picture of a life of a Tulian. And much thanks to the San Fernando Valley JACL.
Is Masako's collection anywhere that can be viewed in a gallery or anything?
Not really. I have it here at home. And that first slide, since you asked me to describe it, was my mother carrying me. So it's kind of like just amazing that they included me, because they could have made the story end when it did, because I came up a little later. I was 5 months old when we left camp. But if you could imagine making teapots and vases and then coming up with what you see right now, it's just very, very healing for her, actually, to be able to get this out. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.